Hello and welcome to the show. Now, if you want a modern hypercar, there are certainly plenty to choose from. You've got the Lamborghini Veneno, there are various special edition Pagani Zondas that are incredibly fast, but right at the very top of the hypercar tree you have this, the LaFerrari. A stupid name maybe, but it is still very, very fast. 963 horsepower in this car, 663 torques, all with a weight of 3,031 pounds. It is a very, very quick car. Unfortunately, the Porsche isn't in Forza 5, but we do have the Mclaren P1. Very similar statistics on this car. However, slightly less horsepower, only 903 in this car. Exactly the same torque and a little bit heavier than the Ferrari at about 3,300 pounds. The thing is, I don't like either of these two cars particularly. Neither of them really interest me in some ways. While yes, they are very, very fast cars, they don't quite interest me in the same way that the Hennessey Venom does. This is, quite frankly, a crazy contraption, by far the most powerful car that we have here. 1,200 horsepower, 1,155 torque. Oh, and it's also the lightest at 2,700 pounds-ish, just under. That's an incredible power-to-weight ratio, all through the rear wheels of the car. Oh, and there's no electrical systems, there's no movable aero parts. It's all you try and flail around to keep the car on the track. We decided to start off with a little drag race. Now, the Venom is the quicker of the cars in a top speed-wise. However, it is got a lot of power and torque, and I expected it to struggle off the line. It didn't take long. It took nowhere near as long as I expected to simply breeze past the other two cars, and then they did not stand a chance. With so much power and torque, I expected the Venom to really struggle to put the power down compared to the other two cars. The Ferrari and the Mclaren are not slow cars, but they kept up for maybe a quarter of a mile-ish at best, and then the Venom was gone. There was nothing they could do about it. Following the LaFerrari this time round, you can see everybody is fairly even down the first straight bit, and then the Venom is just gone. I really thought that both the Ferrari and the McLaren would hold it for a lot longer, but no, they didn't. Then an interesting thing happens. The Ferrari gets the better start and starts to pull away a little bit from the McLaren. The McLaren then quickly reels him in and goes past. You may sit there and say, well, the McLaren is in the slipstream. Yes, it was. However, when the Ferrari then goes in the slipstream of the McLaren, it can't keep up. The Ferrari, it seems, is the slower of the three cars. The cars are still going so fast that the replay has a little bit of a problem following them, a little bit of a freeze, but never mind. I decided to have another run, slightly change the drivers around in the other two cars. This time I got a much better launch with the Venom, neck and neck with the Ferrari, already clear of the McLaren, long before we even reached the first corner, and then once we were around the corner, I instantly dropped the Ferrari, and the Venom is off, again, shooting down the Le Mans straight. This time out, though, the cars behind, the McLaren sat in the slipstream for only a short period behind the Ferrari, got in front, and as you can see there, the Ferrari even sat fairly close to the back of the McLaren for a little while anyway. Couldn't do anything about it. So when it comes to a straight line speed and to a drag race, the Venom will easily beat them, even with all of the power and none of the technology, or less of the technology I should say. The Venom will still be, I still think it'd beat them in a quarter of a mile quite easily as well. It can use its power, but racing on a track is a very different matter. Now to test this, I went to two different tracks, starting off with Spa. I had 8 laps at Spa to set lap times with each of the cars. Now Spa is a pretty damn fast track. It's a long circuit with a lot of medium and high-speed corners. Okay, there's the chicane at the very end, but most of the track here, medium and high-speed corners, quite a lot of straights as well. So this is perhaps a little bit more Venom territory, but it's still a pretty fast circuit. There's a lot of corners to worry about. The McLaren went first in this one, and I have talked about the McLaren before. I do not like the way that this car drives at all. We see coming into this fast section, trying to carry a little bit too much speed on the exit, get it a bit sideways, and the McLaren is round in a circle. Recover it okay, but the McLaren went for a little bit of a spin. The problem I have with the McLaren is when you take the medium and the faster speed corners, you're never quite sure what the back end is going to do. Sometimes you will have grip, and other times you will have none of the grip at all, and the car will flail sideways, or you'll end up just pointing backwards. And when you're driving at a track like Spa that is incredibly fast, you don't want to have an incredibly unpredictable car. That's not going to be helpful for a good lap time. If you get everything right and the car is behaving itself, of course, the McLaren is a quick car around here. There's no doubting that. But I really don't like the unpredictability of the McLaren. It's just, you never come out to a corner, you never quite know. Now, it's fine through these final turns, through the chicane. Don't have any problems through here because it's all slow speed, and don't have any problems in turn 1. But everywhere else, it's all, you don't quite know. Will the back end stick to the road? Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. Take a tiny little bit different line, the car gets very unhappy and will probably throw you into the grass or into a wall. Up next, it was the LaFerrari's turn. The McLaren set a time of 2 minutes 22.338, and now the LaFerrari would go out and see if I could beat that. Instantly, this car is much nicer to drive. It is an awful lot nicer to drive than the McLaren. It's just a lot more predictable with this. I know what the LaFerrari is going to do, and it is going to have plenty of grip. This car is quick through the corners. I think is a bit better than the McLaren, and certainly you can push the LaFerrari through the turns because I believe that it is going to actually stick to the road, whereas the McLaren, you never really know. Admittedly, the Ferrari, as we saw when it came to the drag race, maybe not quite as quick in a straight line as the other cars, and there are some long straights here. However, it has still got decent acceleration. Being lighter than the McLaren certainly helps it on that front. You saw for the first quarter of a mile, maybe half a mile, it kept up with the McLaren, and only a couple of times the straights really exceed that around here. So the LaFerrari is not too bad off on that front. It's just a lot more forgiving. I mean, you saw me coming into the braking zone at that fast chicane. I had a wheel on the grass out wide a little bit. If I'd done that in the McLaren, I probably would have clonked a wall or spun it. But in this, it's had a little wiggle, and then we got it back on the road. I was pushing through this corner here. You can see we're starting to get a bit of a slide. I then get a bit of a slide and end up across the grass with two wheels. And still, the LaFerrari holds on to the track. Even when you make small mistakes, I think this is one of the earlier laps with the Ferrari, even when you make small mistakes, it's forgiving enough to let you get away with them, if you like. And the lap time reflected it. It was a 2 minutes 20.403 in the Ferrari, 2 seconds quicker than the McLaren, and I'm not massively surprised about that. It's just a much nicer car to drive around here. I'd much rather go racing with the LaFerrari than take the McLaren around here, because I believe that the back end of this car will stay on the road. Again, I clipped the grass a little, again pushing the car maybe a little too hard through these turns on this lap. But you couldn't get away with that in a McLaren. In the LaFerrari though, you can. And then we move on to the Venom. Probably the most difficult car to drive here because it has a lot of power and, yeah, not the same technologies as the other cars. I may have had a few offs like this. The thing with the Venom is, again, these were some of the earlier runs to show some of the issues I was having with the car. The thing with the Venom is that it is so incredibly fast. It has got very good brakes, but when you come to a braking zone, you are going 30, 40 miles an hour faster than anything else there is. That's just how fast accelerating this car is, which means you've got to brake a lot earlier than everything else. And when you've just gone from driving the other cars to driving this, occasionally it takes a little bit of time to adjust to driving a Venom, because it's just ludicrous. The minute you get it pointed in a straight line and go, it is so unbelievably quick. Handling wise, it's not as bad as you expect. It has got humongous rear tyres, which means putting the power down is not too bad. Yes, you will slide a 1,200 horsepower car. It doesn't take much, but it isn't as ridiculous as you expect. I mean, through these corners, it didn't do too badly. It wasn't a horrible car to drive. I hate the Veyron SS. I really don't like driving it because it's too heavy and too unmanoeuvrable and the brakes are terrible. But this isn't. This is relatively easy to drive, all things considered. You know, considering the power and the speed that you get out of this car, it really is relatively easy to drive. And the lap times, well, the Venom did a 2:22.016. It's 0.2 of a second quicker than the Mclaren. It's going to upset some people, but yeah, the Venom, it makes up all of its time in the straights and the acceleration zones. And the thing with the Venom is it probably is trickier to drive than the P1, but I prefer it because at least you know what you're getting with a Venom. When you're coming up to a corner, I know what to expect from a Venom. I know it's probably going to slide at some point. In fact, I know it's definitely going to slide if I put too much power down. And it's sort of predictably bad, whereas the Mclaren is unpredictably fairly good, if that makes sense. So after the laps at Spa, I'm maybe not too surprised to see the Venom mixing it up with these two cars. I thought I'd take it to a very different track. The Long Beach circuit, probably the most technical, the twistiest, and definitely the least suited to the Venom that I can go to on Forza 5. Unlike Spa, that everywhere is high speed and pretty high speed corners, here you don't really get that. The first kind of kink on the straight is the only high speed corner. Everywhere else here are pretty big braking zones and pretty slow speed corners, certainly if you compare them to Spa. The Mclaren was much better to drive here. Much preferred driving this car here than I did at Spa. Now, I mixed things up while the Mclaren footage is first. This was the last car that I drove at Long Beach, so everything, I'm trying to be as fair as possible when it came to these times. Had 5 laps with this car here. I know Long Beach very, very well, so had just 5 laps with the cars here. And yeah, the Mclaren was much nicer to drive. We didn't have the high-speed problems. We were flat out through turn 1 without too many issues, you can see. It had enough grip for turn 1. Yeah, it was a much nicer car to drive around Long Beach. Lap time wise, it was a 1:22.285 from the McLaren. Yeah, and I definitely preferred. Definitely preferred the cars here. Didn't have too many problems with the curbs with any of these vehicles. In fact, here, I mean, I was perhaps since I didn't have a huge amount of laps, I was perhaps being a little bit more cautious, trying to avoid them. The curbs here are horribly nasty to race cars, but yeah, even when I did run over them with these cars, they weren't too bad. I mean, you saw on the start of this lap, I clipped a couple of them with the P1. Didn't really have too many issues with the curbs, which is always nice. We then move on to the LaFerrari, and it was good at Spa. It was yet again pretty damn good here. It's just got that little bit more grip than the McLaren. It means you can carry that little bit more corner speed. At Long Beach, cars, you kind of have to have almost specific sort of cars. If you can carry a lot of corner speeds, you are going to be fast here. But it does also help to have good acceleration in between the corners, and you definitely want good brakes. There is a lot of big braking zones here. So that acceleration in between the turns, the Ferrari has that, because it's lighter, a little bit more powerful than the McLaren. Again, we saw in the drag race, the initial launch and the initial part of the drag race, the Ferrari could keep up with the Venom for a little while, and there's not long straights here. There's not long straights at all here. So the Ferrari's acceleration in between the turns is very, very useful. Yes, we've got a 900 horsepower hypercar. Yes, the Ferrari will slide. The McLaren will slide if you try and put the power down a little bit too soon. But on the most, I mean, you have to be being a real moron as well to get these cars to slide. You have to be really pushing the cars if you want them to slide around. They're not hard to drive sensibly. Admittedly, that is quite a strange thing to say about these ludicrous cars, but they're really not that hard to keep this vehicle under control around here. Even, you know, coming out of this tight hairpin, this is one of the slowest corners you will find on a racetrack. And as you see here, the Ferrari, it was incredibly composed. Again, we're talking flat out around this first corner. Things are at the 500 board. You're jumping on the brakes with this car, and it will stop for turn 1. Again, curbs, not too much of a problem with the Ferrari. And when it came to the lap times, a 1:20.392. Again, 2 seconds quicker, near enough, than the McLaren P1. It's just a nicer car to drive. It's quicker accelerating in between the corners, and it has a bit better grip through the turns. We come to the Venom next. Now, this is not a track suited to this car in any way, shape or form. There is one sort of long straight, but is interrupted by a rather nasty turn halfway around it. Everywhere else, the straights are pretty short. The corners are fairly slow, which means traction and drive out of the turns are very important, and that is where I feared the Venom would be a pain, because most of these you're leaving the corners probably second gear. Sometimes some of them are even first gear corners, and when you have as much power and torque as you have in the Venom, you fear quite a lot of wheel spin. You don't want the car, I mean, if you're wheel spinning and sliding, you're going to be losing all of the lap time, so you've got to do your best to keep the Venom under control. And again, it surprised me with just how easy it was. I mean, this is, as I said, this is not an easy car to drive per se, but when you think of taking this around Long Beach, you expect it to be horrendous. And the truth was, it isn't. It isn't horrendous around here. Will you slide it? Yes. Will it take much? No, not really. But if you are careful, I mean, you will have to be careful, certainly out of this hairpin here. You will have to be careful on the throttle. But you can do it, and it doesn't take hundreds of hours to get right. You can drive this car around here without too many problems. That kink on the straight is scary as hell. In the Venom, you can just about get it flat out, maybe with a little lift. You saw there it was starting to wander towards the wall and wanting to go sideways again, putting power down out of here. This is the first gear corner, up into second. Still, not that many problems with the Venom. And its lap time, again, going to upset a few people, a 121.948, and this was the first car out of the three that I drove here. It beats the Mclaren P1. It beats the P1's lap time, and I think the way it does it is while it's not as quick through the turns, it has so much acceleration in between the corners that that's where it makes its lap time. So the Venom gets a second place at the track it really doesn't like, or shouldn't like, I should say. Of the three cars, what one is quicker? Well, quite obviously the Ferrari. If it comes to circuit racing, the Ferrari is the quicker of the three by almost 2 seconds a lap. Admittedly, straight line speed is not quite so good, but it is a lot easier to drive. It has very, very good corner grip. Yeah, it's just the quicker car, and the acceleration out of the turns on almost every racetrack is more than enough to you're never going to get up to the really high speeds that the Ferrari would struggle on most racetracks. Le Mans is the only one really with that size of straight. Of the three cars, which one would I have? Of course, it would be the Venom. The LaFerrari and Mclaren, while very, very good cars, I don't know, there's just something about them doesn't excite me particularly. They're just not particularly exciting cars. Whereas the Venom, I find is much more exciting. It's also much more rewarding. When you complete a lap with this car, certainly at somewhere like Long Beach, you complete a lap with a Venom, it feels like an achievement. Getting this car, surviving a lap around Long Beach, feels like an achievement in this vehicle. Whereas in the Ferrari and the McLaren, it doesn't. If I was doing a race, I would certainly want to be driving the Ferrari, because you're going to be quickest of the three, but you're also going to be lovely and consistent with that. But when you're just hot lapping, just messing around, the sense of achievement you get with the Venom is far greater. There is another, though, fairly big but, and the fact is, I wouldn't have any of these three cars. You see, I'll give you a simple scenario. Let's say you go to a car show, and they park a McLaren F1 that we have here, alongside a McLaren P1. What do you go and look at first? Because I know I'm going to go and look at the McLaren F1. This car is, to me, far more interesting. It's still, I believe, the fastest naturally aspirated car in the world. If not, it is certainly right at the very top there. There was no rivals when the F1 came out. Nothing even got near it for many, many years. I find this car is far more interesting. The P1's come out, and there's already three cars, the Ferrari and the Porsche. Maybe you'll count the Venom and the Veyron. There's already sort of 5 rivals to the P1. The F1 was unrivaled for years. The Ferrari, okay, admittedly you may not call an F40 a hypercar, but you park an F40 next to a LaFerrari. I'm going to go look at the F40. I find the F40, again, another much more interesting car, and while, yes, it did have its rivals in the Porsche 959, the Porsche and the Ferrari went about things in a completely different way. The Porsche was very high-tech for its era, whereas the F40 was all about make it lightweight and make it as close to a track car as possible while still just about having it road legal. And again, nothing was really quite like the F40. But when it comes to the very ultimate in hypercars, still nothing gets close to the TVR Speed 12, I'm sorry. But as much as I would love to have this car in Forza 5, sadly it isn't. I would love to have it for a test against them, but nothing gets close to the Speed 12, because this thing is quite frankly ludicrous. The engine, nobody knows how much power it actually had when they first made it. It broke the dyno. They reckoned it was about 900 to 1,000 horsepower plus. Nobody is 100% sure. When they sent one of their test drivers home with the car, he decided it was far too powerful and too dangerous for the road, so they cancelled production. Only one was ever made road legal. I believe the one that's road legal is slightly restricted in power to something like 800 horsepower. The TVR Speed 12 is just such a ludicrous, crazy car that you want one. You want a Speed 12, even though it will probably kill you driving this fast. You just want one, and that to me is what a hypercar is all about. As good as the Ferrari and Mclaren are, they just don't have the same excitement, and they're just not as interesting as the likes of this Speed 12. Anyway, that is it from me, so thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.